Hello, hello. It is so weird to be on a live stream by myself without my work wife. My work husband, Chris Tronson. And it is also so weird to be on at night. You guys know that I am usually on Wednesdays at noon, so this is a different thing for me. But I am covering tonight for Ethan. I know I don't replace Ethan, but here I am. I'm going to do my best. So excited to be here. So this is Community Conversations, and I was just reflecting on this today when I was going to cover tonight for Ethan. He had some traveling delays, as I was just thinking, like, wow, when's the last time I was able to just sit and chat with our community and not have all these clinical questions and stuff we have to answer that Chris and I cover during the live stream. So I'm just super excited for tonight, and of course grateful to be here and be with you guys. So please say hi, tell me who you are, where you're joining from, and more importantly, I want today to be an opportunity for you guys to just tell me what you want to hear, but also, like, I just want this to be an active live conversation. So I want us to just be chatting, talking, answering questions, and literally anything you want to ask me, it's on the table. Like, just ask away. As always, a couple of updates to remember. Our live streams are not intended to be clinical. They're not intended to replace therapy. And of course, IOCDF and or our live streams are not intended to be or cannot be a crisis line. So if you're feeling unsafe or suicidal, please call the National Crisis Line at 988. You can, of course, also go to your local emergency room or call 911. So excited to be here. Tell me who y'all are and where you're joining from, and give me some updates of what y'all want to hear today and what y'all want to talk about, anything. So let's just start with your weather. It's 103 degrees in Texas. I'm not joking. Literally 103 degrees. So in case you're wondering why it's sunny and you're like jealous, like, don't be jealous. It is so hot. You cannot breathe when you go outside here in Texas. And all of us want to escape the heat, but we are stuck here. So instead, we'd rather be indoors with you guys. So that's us. Hi, Matthew. So good to see you. Hi, Amy. It's great to see you. Love having all of y'all join from the UK, from Wisconsin, from anywhere. So please say hi. As y'all know, there's always a million questions that are pre-submitted for our community conversations. And so I'm actually going to just start with those, and we're going to go from there. So I'm going to start with the community conversations, but please use the comment pane to ask any questions you have right now so that I can answer and chat with you guys in real time. And of course, as y'all know, I talk really fast. It's who I am, but I try to get content by. But more importantly, I also always have to give a little bit of like thoughts and reflections around things I've been thinking lately in the OCD world, or maybe it's sometimes things that bother me, but like, you're going to hear it all. That's what you're here for. Hopefully that's what you're excited about. So yeah, here we are. Another day, another sermon. Is that what we're going to call it, from Liz? Hopefully you're like, yeah, I feel like it's going to leave you feeling good in different ways. So I'm going to start with my own kind of current soapbox. So you guys, I have been so frustrated and upset that I feel like lately there's been a lot of talk or belief or misconceptions from people that ERP is harmful, but also that ERP and uncertainty have gotten this like really confusing bad rap. So let me explain a little bit. So I feel like so many people have started to believe that if we do ERP treatment, and if we do ERP treatment the way we're supposed to do it, what that means is that we have to accept uncertainty forever. And what I feel like in turn it has become is it's become this belief or understanding that that means I'm never going to know who I am. I always have to be uncertain or unsure if I'm these scary, terrible things, that I'll never have clarity, and I have to be okay with never having clarity. And also, sorry, you can bleep me out if y'all want on the back end, but you don't have to if you don't want to. That you have to be comfortable feeling like shit forever. That is not what ERP is, you guys. ERP is not intended to be this torturous treatment where you're never going to get clarity around these horrible, scary OCD fears, and or it is not intended to have you believe that you have to experience distress forever, that you are always going to have to feel uncomfortable. This message that, oh, because we have OCD, we have to suffer forever. You guys, that is not the right message. ERP should get you freedom. If you do ERP correctly, you should have insight. I can tell you with clarity, my OCD fears are not true. I am not a pedophile. I am, in fact, of my faith background and believe in it strongly. That's important to me. I am not going to harm people I love. Like all those things that OCD made me believe could be true. After good ERP, I can tell you with certainty, actually, and with clarity that that is not the case. And so I want to make sure that we don't have this idea or understanding, you guys, that ERP treatment means we have to like suffer forever or we have to always live in the unknown. Yes, you might have to live in the unknown while you're doing treatment, right? For the small finite amount of time. But once you've leaned in, once you've done the treatment, you're able to get freedom. And freedom doesn't mean, oh, you can live by your values while you're still struggling. If you guys are doing that, we are not at a place of freedom. If we're having to just push through difficulties, we are not at a place of freedom. And that's okay. But I want to make sure we know that freedom is possible. Functioning, which is pushing through difficult times, right? Or like living by our values while it being really hard. Functioning is a great step, but it is not the treatment goal. The treatment goal is freedom. And so if you are with a clinician or if you're doing work and y'all haven't talked about core fears and you haven't done ERP while leaning into your core fears and you haven't gotten to a point where you're not afraid of anything OCD throws at you and like no matter what it brings up, it's not triggering, it's not anxiety provoking, it's not activating, then you still have work to do. And if you do the right work, you can get to a place where thoughts are never triggers, where thoughts don't stick. You do not have to believe that throughout your life, thoughts are always going to stick and you have to push through them. That is not the truth. You can get to a place where you have freedom. And then I keep hearing people say, okay, so what does ERP as a lifestyle mean? Like we have to accept ERP as a lifestyle. Let's get rid of that language. Like ERP as a lifestyle is just not a helpful language anymore because I feel like everyone's hearing that as like, oh, I have to do ERP forever. See, that means I'm always going to struggle and I always have to do ERP and I'm always going to struggle and I always have to do ERP. No. What we actually mean is you get to just live life. We're not going to call it ERP as a lifestyle and blowing that up. We're going to call it living life. You, with effective treatment, you get the greatest gift treatment could give you, which is the gift to be able to live your life however you want to live it without OCD making any decisions, enforcing any rules, or policing what you do or how you live any minute of the day. And that's what we're here for. That's what this foundation is here for. That's what this community is here for. That's what those of us who come here and talk to y'all are here for, is to help, not just to remind you of that message, but help guide you to where that message can be the reality for you every day of your life. So thank you for letting me be here and be that voice. Let's get into questions. Y'all are putting a couple, so we'll start there and then we'll go back. People from Canada, people from Virginia, good to see y'all. Matt, I'm cracking up that you saw my Spanish video. I know Chris and I talked about that, so hopefully that gave you some, I don't know what we're going to call it, but hopefully it was exciting. So let's start with Spence Robert at 6:05 my time. Does your definition of stigmatization include trivialization? And trivialization, is it a kind of stigmatization? I'm used to thinking of them as being opposites. It's a good question. You know, I think that instead of saying yes or no, or it includes this or doesn't include this, I just want to say that stigma is any time we feel like we're being misunderstood, we're being misheard, our disorders being categorized incorrectly, right? What I would say is like when it feels like it feels wrong, it feels off, it feels disingenuous, right? Stigmatization can happen in so many ways, right? It can happen subtly where like people don't even realize they're stigmatizing you. It can happen overtly, and it can happen on a huge platform, on a small platform. So, you know, I think when you think about it, I want you to think about stigma as being this thing that we carry or could carry, but also being something that makes you feel like your illness is being downplayed, misunderstood, different, minimized, right? All of those things. The great news is that the stigma around mental health, the stigma around OCD has really shifted. I know we have so much work to do. I'm not here to say we're done, but to think about what's happened over the past 15 years, I've been advocating since I was 17, almost 20 years now, not to age myself, but it has really changed, right? The understanding of OCD, people's understanding of just even the acronym OCD, like people didn't know what that was when I was first diagnosed compared to where we are now. There is a huge difference, and that's pretty exciting. Amy, I love to hear that ERP brought you freedom because it allows you to live according to your values. The freedom has brought you peace. I always tell people that there is no greater gift on earth that we can get than the gift of peace. So the fact that you have been able to get that is, it's incredible. It shows the power of this treatment and how much it works. So I'm excited that you like my quotes, Matt, and others. All right. OCD Warrior at 609. I have our OCD and my boyfriend is moving in soon, but I've been struggling with whether I want to break up. I'm not sure if this is OCD or not. Is there a way to tell if this is an intrusive urge or a real desire? So great question, and one we get all the time, right? How, when I have a thought, do I know, how can I differentiate, is a thought OCD or is this a genuine thought or something I can explore? And of course, with our OCD, it could be really tricky because the way our OCD, which is relationship OCD, works is it attempts to make you question whether or not what you're thinking is valid or not, right? And what you're thinking. And so this is exactly like, could definitely be our OCD. What I always want to say in general is if it feels urgent, if it feels like it's something we have to immediately address or figure out or solve or confess or get reassurance for, it's probably OCD, right? If it feels urgent and critical, right, it's probably OCD. But if I were to say to you, if you didn't have OCD, what would you do? If you were to say, I would still have my boyfriend move in and I might, see after 6 months how it's going, or maybe I would be, then it's OCD, right? You should let him move in. But if you're really thinking, honestly, like whether I had OCD or not, I'm really not sure if we are here and like I'm not feeling comfortable about it, then that's a different place, right? And I know you might say, well, Liz, it's hard for me to get quiet, but most of us, you guys, when we're dealing with OCD and anxiety, we know when there's anxiety or OCD attached to our decision. And so I want to say, like, if I were to ask you candidly, if you didn't have anxiety or OCD making this decision, what would you do? See if you could come up with a quick answer. Now, what you might say is, oh, I'd let my boyfriend move in, or I wouldn't let him move in. But then you might say, but I'm not sure, or blah, blah, blah. And then all of a sudden we go into these like buts and what ifs. That's OCD, right? It's kind of go with what you want at the beginning, what Liz says, what you say versus what OCD or anxiety is saying. But it's a good question, and what I always say though, as someone who lives with OCD, we typically know, right? Because it feels urgent, there's anxiety attached, and it is not necessarily by our values. We're making decisions by our OCD. So you might say, well, I really want my boyfriend to move in. I really want us to try and see if this works. But then OCD is like, but should you? And does this make sense? And maybe the relationship isn't the right one. And maybe you shouldn't be in it. It's like, oh, but then not having him move in is making a decision for anxiety versus my value, which is that I wanted us to try living together and see how that goes. Erica at 612, what about level of severity with OCD? I mean, I don't think I'd call it living the ERP lifestyle, but I do still have to use what I've learned in ERP in my life from time to time, and it varies in intensity and frequency. This is a great question. And I think to answer that, you can call it ERP as a lifestyle, and that's totally fine, right? I've called it that most of my life. But what I mean is that I feel like that language has made people think that what we're saying is that for the rest of your life, you always are going to have to do ERP all the time. But that does not mean that those of us with OCD are never going to have to deploy, right, our ERP techniques or, do exposures or, make sure when something gets loud that we don't address it right away. Like we absolutely will want to, right? We want to be doing ERP proactively versus reactively. We don't want to wait and not do it and let a trigger get the best of us. So if we know, hey, this trigger's loud, or this one's got a little bit more weight, or this one kind of stopped me in my tracks for a second, then yeah, we want to deploy ERP, and that's super important to do. But what I'm saying is that I don't want anyone to think that effective OCD treatment means that for the rest of your life, you have to suffer at the highest level you've suffered, and you just have to try to do ERP all the time. that is often what we call white knuckling, right? What that often would mean is that there's something we're holding on to, right? We're kind of doing ERP, but we're holding on, or we're doing it, but we're just gritting through and we're just waiting till we ritualize, or waiting until we can get some, relief. That is not going to get you freedom, right? But if you're doing ERP and getting freedom, that is what we're fighting for. That does not mean you're never going to have to do ERP again, right? Or that you're never going to have, I think I've told the story, but after I had my daughter, I had a sexual intrusive thought. It was pretty graphic. It was she was probably 6 months or so. I'm not sure exactly how old she was at the time. And it really kind of threw me off for a second. And maybe more than a second, a couple of minutes, whatever I want to say. And when it threw me off, right, I had to stop for a second and re-engage and make sure that I was doing ERP, because I knew that, man, that had pull. I could have easily fallen into rituals. But I still have freedom from it, because, again, that took me a few seconds to deploy ERP and get freedom, versus if I would have ritualized and would have stayed really stuck, right? So remember, trying to solve things gets us stuck. Ritualizing or compulsions make us more confused. And so it's really about, can we make sure we're deploying it when needed? But when I talk about ERP as a lifestyle, what I'm talking about is it should be a few seconds, right? It should be a really quick decision of scared of that, I'm going to purposely lean in, versus I let the fear happen. I start avoiding, I start being triggered. For 4 days, it builds up. And then I'm having to do ERP, but I'm kind of doing it and I'm not really getting freedom, but I'm doing enough of it to function. We can do ERP to function, or we can do ERP all the way to get freedom. I put a post on this on Instagram last week, and one of the questions I got was can I do more and talk more about core fears? And I'm happy to do a whole webinar and seminar on core fears if that would be useful. But we have to be addressing our core fears. My mom used to tell me that it was therapeutic to pull weeds, and she probably would still say that, and that's fine, but I'm not that interested in pulling weeds all day. She likes it. But if you've ever seen weeds grow, we have some at our clinic's parking lot here, so if y'all want to come pick some, feel free. When you see a weed, there's a couple ways we can address it, right? We can spray some, whatever it's called, but weed killer. We could use a weed whacker and get rid of the weeds so that it looks pretty. But both of those ways, we've kind of we've made it functional where it looks pretty for today, or it's functional, but it's going to grow back. And we're not actually getting it at the root. But if you pick a weed, and you've ever picked a weed, the reason my mom tells you it's peaceful is that when you pull that weed, you see the root. And there's this satisfaction, right? Gratification that comes with that, because you know that you've gotten it, right? It's not going to grow back, you've addressed it. You've gotten that weed, it is gone. Its siblings might not be gone, but it's gone. And so I want to really help you understand that with ERP treatment, you can do kind of basic ERP, right? My doorknob's contaminated. I'm going to touch it, and I'm going to do response prevent, which is the exposure. I'm going to do response prevention, which is not wash my hands. And I'm going to keep doing that. And eventually that doorknob won't feel as scary or triggering. But if I don't figure out what is the core fear around that doorknob, am I afraid of getting a bloodborne illness? Am I afraid of getting someone else sick? Am I afraid that I'm going to die? What am I actually afraid of that even makes that doorknob be triggering? And once I figure that out, my core fear, and I do ERP plus addressing my core fear, so I do ERP and I lean into the core fear at the same time, not only do I get rid of the fear of the doorknob, I start to get rid of that core fear that also makes 100 other things in my life feel contaminated or triggering. And so when we address the core fear, we unravel so much else that OCD is latching onto. But if we don't address the core fear, what ends up happening is OCD just keeps jumping. And those of us with OCD talk about it feeling like a game of whack-a-mole. I address one thing and another thing pops up and another thing pops up. Because what we're basically doing in that sense is a more old school exposure model of let's extinguish this doorknob, the fear of the doorknob, versus let's extinguish your core fear. If we extinguish the fear of the doorknob, we still have all the other things that are contaminated from the core fear and all the new stuff that's going to become contaminated from our core fears. But instead, if we extinguish the core fear, not only does the doorknob no longer become contaminated or triggering, all the other things that were contaminated or triggering because of that core fear also wipe away. And so you get freedom, right? You get freedom, you get that weed. It's so important. And so it's so important to think about. I love that you are thinking about peer support stuff, Matthew. I don't know as much about the training for in the UK, but it's exciting. And I love seeing so many people get reconnected in our field and start helping other people through advocacy and work. Understanding your core fears or underlying OCD can be helpful in understanding your depression too. Absolutely, right? So it is so important to understand that when we are addressing our core fears, right, sometimes they are rooted in depression. Sometimes it's rooted in this like other underlying fear that's so, right? So let's just do a kind of example, right? But let's pretend that I am triggered by this coffee cup. I like Starbucks. And so, sorry, it's like one of those things, you know, you pick up your coffee, you're like, well, I have to have a sip now. So let's pretend the coffee cup is triggering to me. Fine, I can say it's triggering, it's anxiety provoking. Why is it triggering to me? Right? So when you say, well, how do I figure out my core fears? I want you to practice this, right? I'm going to say to you, okay, so like, why is that coffee cup triggering? And you're going to say, well, it is, well, I don't know what you're going to say, right? But let's just pretend you say, well, because I'm afraid if I touch it, my hands will be contaminated. Okay, so what if your hands are contaminated? Well, if my hands are contaminated, then, well, you know, so what? Like, well, then when I touch something else, I could be spreading my contamination. Okay, so like, what if you're contaminated? What sort of contamination? Well, I'm afraid that, what if the barista had a Band-Aid on their hand and there's bloodborne illness on this cup? Oh, okay, so you're afraid you might get bloodborne illness on your hand and then touch other things. So what if you did? And what if you spread it? Then what? You might say, well, my biggest fear would be that I'm going to get someone else sick, and now someone else might get an illness because of me. And if someone else gets an illness because of me, or harm happens to someone else, I just don't know how I can tolerate that. Oh, so your core fear is not this coffee cup, right? This is just like a prop, right? Your core fear is causing harm to someone else. And so while we could extinguish the coffee cup being contaminated, if we don't extinguish the underlying core fear that you might harm someone else or that you could cause harm to someone else, it is something else is going to feel contaminated. Something else is going to be triggering, or it already is. And so we really, you guys, have to make sure we're addressing the core fear at the same time, right? So how do you do that? Okay, so are you still going to do ERP? Like, are you still gonna, is it important to still touch the coffee cup? Of course it is, right? So we're still gonna do ERP. So ERP is exposure response prevention. We're still gonna touch the coffee cup, right? This would be my exposure. We're gonna engage in response prevention. So that's response prevention is we want you to prevent whatever your typical response is once you feel like you've been exposed to a trigger. Let's just say my typical response prevention, if the coffee cup was contaminated, I feel like, did I get water all over me? Sorry. If the coffee cup was contaminated and, you know, maybe my typical ritual or response is to go wash my hands. And so, you know, of course, the exposure, touch the coffee cup, the response prevention is I'm not going to go hand wash. But really, you guys, I don't want to spread it at that. I don't want to stop it at that. What I want to do is I actually want to do exposures that look like this. Touch the coffee cup, don't wash my hands, commit that I'm not, and say to myself, like, who knows what may or may not be on my hands, and like can't confirm or deny what could happen, but I'm going to choose to go on with my day anyway. And the way I continue that exposure is I go on and I still touch other stuff, do other things. I am not going, oh yeah, I might give someone a bloodborne illness. It might be my fault. Like, I might be this horrible person. Like, why would we need to do that? That's just not fun. Like, that just makes us think these fears are rooted in reality and that they might actually happen. And like, that's when people say, like, do you have to accept your worst fears as truth? Like, of course not. That sounds awful. But what I also can't do is like, okay, I'm going to touch the coffee cup and not wash my hands. But like, I'm going to say to myself, you know, okay, but people do that all the time. And I know there's not actually a risk in that, and no one's actually going to get hurt and everything's okay. Because that message, you guys, is also a reassuring message that we're still giving the power to the fear. So what we're doing is we're still trying to confirm or deny whether the fear is real, and we're avoiding thinking of it, right? So we're trying to replace it with like, oh, this is safe, or this is okay, or it's fine for me to do this. And the problem with that is that we're still validating the fear. I want you to not validate the fear at all, right? Like I literally want you to not validate the fear. So I want it to just be like, all right, afraid I might spread it and gonna choose to still go do these actions anyways, right? Gonna still go touch stuff and do everything else. I want you to choose to leave it unanswered. Now, the problem is that people hear that and think that what I'm saying, or what we're saying in the OCD world, is that you are never going to have the answers, and you are going to always have to live with something around whether or not you might give someone a bloodborne illness. You're going to have to live with that forever and think that it could happen, and that's never going to be answered. That is not true. I want to be very clear about that. Like, it is like, once you do this work, if you lean all the way in, if you're not holding on, if you're 2 feet in, not 1 foot in, 1 foot out, what ends up happening is you're able to be like, later on when you see someone with a Band-Aid, like, doesn't even trigger you. You're not even bothered by it, right? Because you know that's OCD, that's ridiculous, and you become confident in yourself. You have clarity in knowing that that's OCD, that's not me. But every time we ritualize, every time we avoid, we actually get rid of the clarity. We loosen it, we weaken it, and we have less and less clarity around whether or not that might actually be true. And we start to think it might actually be true, and we get more stuck. Thanks for sharing these. Some of y'all are sharing core fears, which is really helpful. And we can talk more about it. Core fears can be so many different things, right? They're not just one thing, but I like some of y'all love the examples that some of you guys are giving. So Amy, I want to talk about yours for a second, because I think this is important. So Amy said that at 624, it would be a coffee cup. If I spread contamination and get someone else sick, then I'm a bad person and I won't be accepted and I'll be alone forever. And I love that you laid this out, just because, again, every person's core fear is maybe different. And so it's important to not extrapolate. Oh, you have contamination OCD. You're afraid you're going to get sick. It's like, well, maybe not. Like, maybe it has nothing to do with getting sick. It's actually that I'm going to be alone forever. And that's my fear. So I need y'all all to listen really, really clearly to this, because I think this is so important. A lot of I hate to say old school, that's not fair, but a lot of ERP providers would say, okay, the way to address this is I want you to touch that, and I want you to lean into the fact that, like, yep, you might be alone forever and you'll never know, and we just move forward. I had to get another sip. I just can't get on board with that. Here's the thing. It actually works. If you do that, right, it can get you some freedom from the thought and disentangle it. But why do we need to lean into a depressive statement that is the opposite of what we want? For example, Amy could probably do the same exposure and get not just the same results, maybe better results. It might actually be an even harder exposure for you to touch the coffee cup, lean into the fear that, like, oh, I'm afraid I might get people sick. Guess I don't know for sure if that will happen, but I am so excited to be in a relationship and have a fulfilling, loving life that I know is ahead for me. Imagine that. Like, I'm serious. Like, could you imagine that? Can you imagine if you can do ERP that's values-based? If you can still address the fears, because that's still the fear, but you do it with a positive spin versus this negative uncertainty. We lean into the worst stuff, the worst things, right? Like, when people say, well, like, uncertainty ERP is cruel because, like, people without OCD wouldn't do that, I'm always like, no, it's not. What are you talking about? But then I hear statements of, like, oh yeah, like, I'm going to have to lean into, I'll be lonely forever and I'll probably never have the life I want and I'm never going to have a relationship and I have to just be okay with that. And it's like, well, yeah, that is cruel. Like, that's awful. Like, why would you want to do that? Don't sign me up for that sort of therapy. So do y'all hear that? You can do ERP. You can do uncertainty that gets you closer to the person in life you want that's actually just as triggering. So, Phyllis, core fear of going to hell and feeling like it's a hard one to work with. It is a hard one to work with, especially if we think that ERP treatment means we have to accept going to hell or be okay with going to hell. I wouldn't have done it. I have scrupulosity and I've had don't sign me up for that. But imagine what I'm saying. If you can do ERP, where actually, let's just say one of my scrupulosity rituals, right, is like saying prayers a certain way or getting caught doing it in a certain pattern. And so we purposely do exposures where I, maybe cut my prayer off or I don't do it all the way. And I say something like, who knows what that means, but like, I cannot wait to be in heaven one day. Or I am so excited to see my family in heaven, right? Or whatever your statement is that you look forward to, that we don't have to lean into, I'm going to end up in hell and I'm going to be doomed forever. Like, that's not something anyone would want to lean into. But instead, we lean into the positive that I bet if I were to ask you, Phyllis, or ask someone else, who has the same similar fears, because a couple of people on here, Jen and William, I bet y'all would say, oh, that would still be hard too. Because then OCD would say, well, how do you know you're going to heaven? Well, right? And so OCD treatment can be addressed with the positive values-based twist on your core fears. We don't have to lean into core fears in this negative, dooming, awful, terrible way. So think about that, right? That's the work we do here at our clinic. That's the work providers should be doing. We should be doing ERP work. When we say values-based work, we mean like it should get you closer to your values. Now, what I don't want to mistake that for is sometimes people hear that as like, oh yeah, I never need to do hard exposures, right? I don't need to sit on a floor because like who sits on the floor? Like we sit in chairs, we sit on furniture, like we don't sit on the floor. I know y'all know, and I don't need to show y'all pictures, but I've got a 1 and a 2-year-old that are so cute. My little 1-year-old started to walk this weekend, so fun. They live on the floor. My 1-year-old crawls everywhere. And imagine if I tried to justify why I never need to sit on a floor and I was able to convince you that like, oh, that's not values-based. Like I don't need to sit on the floor. It's no big deal. And then my 1-year-old daughter crawls on the bathroom floor. And because I justified why I didn't need to do that level of exposure, I can't pick her up and hug her and kiss her and be the mom I want to be. So yes, sometimes ERP looks weird. Sometimes we're sitting on the floor. Sometimes we're laying on the ground. Sometimes we're doing really different, strange things. But you guys, it should bring you closer to being able to do anything you want to do in your life where OCD isn't going to make a decision for you, where OCD isn't going to police you, where OCD isn't going to have rigidity be the standard. Think about it. It's pretty cool. The power of exposure, the power of ERP, the power of treatment, you guys, man. It is life-saving and life-changing. And I can tell you that. I see it every day. I live it, and many of you do too. So it's exciting. And I want you to think about that. And if you're with a provider that you don't feel like is getting you closer to that, think about it. Am I with the right provider? Am I doing the right treatment? Am I in the right level of care, right? Sometimes we need more intensive treatment. We need to be in a different level of care. Like all of those things are critical to be thinking about. Someone asked me a question. I got to find it. Zunili at 6:32. How do you go about being afraid of not recovering or feeling stuck? This is one of the most common core fears. Actually, one of the most common core fears that I see is the fear of being anxious forever, the fear of never getting better, the fear of staying stuck, right? So many people will say, well, it's for me, it's actually the fear of anxiety. It's the fear of distress. I don't want to feel this way forever. And so I do these behaviors to try to not have distress. But what ends up happening? Well, I'm like guaranteeing I'm going to have distress forever because I'm staying stuck in the cycle. But the core fear is the fear of having distress, right? But in this case, it's the fear of not recovering. So we're going to lean into that, right? We are going to lean into I'm afraid I might not recover. And yes, I don't know the full answer to that and can't guarantee that, but I'm going to assume that recovery looks like blank, blank, blank for me, and I can't wait to get closer to it. Or how about this? If the fear is that you're not going to recover, I'm going to say, what would recovery look like? And let's have you start doing that. If it would look like dating, if it would look like going back to school, if it would look like getting a job, if it would look like whatever it might be, start doing that. Start doing that, you guys. That's what treatment's all about. Treatment is all about being able to do the opposite of what OCD wants us to do, right? It wants us to stay stuck and like, I'm going to be stuck forever. I'm not going to recover. And because we're so afraid that we feed the fear of that we're not going to recover, we're going to be stuck, we guarantee we're going to stay stuck and not recover. So instead I would say, well, what would recovery look like? Well, let's have you start doing that. You're going to say, well, I'm not ready for it. I'm going to say, yeah, you are. That is the best exposure you can do. Start dating, start recovering. And you know what? I want you to start to learn that I can have distress, I can have anxiety, and I can recover, and I can do these things, right? Which is a part of recovery. And what you're going to find is that you will start to have less distress, less anxiety about it. But you guys, we do have to lean into it. We can't just ignore the fact that like at the core, it's the fear that I'm going to be stuck forever. I'm not going to recover. I want you to be able to unleash, unravel, untie, right? The constraints that fear has on your life. And so I want you to be able to say something like, like sure would be scary to be stuck forever, but it wouldn't be as scary as choosing not to go do the things I want to do in recovery because I'm afraid I'm going to be stuck forever. Right? Let's start leaning into it. Let's start talking about it, right? Yeah, that could happen. And I'm going to choose to go do these things instead. Versus, oh yeah, I'm definitely going to be stuck forever and I'm never going to have the life I want. Like, that's not how we need to do ERP. Instead, let's acknowledge that like, oh yeah, like, okay, like maybe not, guess I can't break. And I'm going to move forward. And when we use some uncertainty and we lean in and we fight it in the moment, right, while we're doing ERP, we end up getting clarity and we don't have to keep using uncertainty anymore. I don't need to use uncertainty anymore about whether I'm a pedophile, whether I'm a bad person like that. I don't need to use that because I know I'm not those things. But I did have to use it during the process to get to the point of having freedom from those thoughts and those thoughts not having a hold on me. But if we don't cut the thoughts, if we don't lean in, if we don't address them and we try to just suppress them, they keep popping up like Pandora's box. If we feed them with rituals, they get bigger and bigger and more powerful. So we do have to address them, but we can address them in a positive way with values and it still be just as triggering. Go ahead and read. There's an amazing article, but I don't know if y'all can look on the back end, but we did a really great webinar with IOCDF. You can find on the YouTube channel with Lauren Wadsworth and Chris Tronson and myself, and it was about values-based ERP. And I love it. I love her and Caitlin Pinciani and some others wrote an amazing article, but then we did a whole webinar on it. And one of the reasons I love it so much is that it just helps us as a field, but also as individuals with OCD recognize that like, oh, we don't have to go to these like extreme negative exposures to get freedom. Sometimes we do. And we know when we do, if like, yeah, I know I need to eat off the floor because like, I just need to take it that far so I can get freedom from this. Okay, great. But so sometimes, right, that overcorrection is important. But many times it's like, that's not values-based. That wouldn't feel good. But actually instead, I could do the same thing. So here's an example. If I have pedophilia OCD, I don't need to go sit at a park and stare at children because that might feel like just weird and uncomfortable to me and like not values-based. But I absolutely need to go play basketball with my nephew. I need to change my daughter's diaper. I need to do all these things that are going to be equally, if not more triggering, but that are also going to bring me closer to my values. And so they're going to feel good while I'm doing them. There's going to be positive intrinsic reward that comes in with it versus, oh, I'm just going and sitting on the bench and feeling uncomfortable and like people are staring at me and I'm at a park without kids. Think about it. How can you make your ERP values-based? Really important. Yes, Kim Quinlan is just so amazing. And, Kim has a self-compassion workbook. It's on my shelf unless someone stole it, but it is there. I don't know if y'all can see it there in this corner. Let's see. Can't see it. Anywho, right there. It's amazing. And Kim's amazing. And self-compassion is so important. And so many of us with OCD were like, self-compassion, like that's the furthest thing from what I want to do. Ali Garza, who's an incredible advocate, just did a post on this and I resonated so much that she was talking about like when she was in treatment, she was like, self-compassion, like, are you kidding? But it is so important, you guys. It is the way we talk to ourselves, the language we use, like it is just so important and such a good reminder for us to be thinking about. Reading, sorry you guys. Next question. We have so many questions. So I'm like, oh, where do I start? Okay, here's some that are similar to what we've been talking about. So I'm going to start here. It's a question we got turned in from the Netherlands, which is so cool. I love that we're reaching so many people. Hello from the Netherlands. I'm pleased to meet y'all. What I've come to learn is that the core issues the core issue comes from acceptance and not being able to give something a place. Am I close to the mark? Totally. Yeah. So, right. So much of this is being able to just accept or allow space is kind of the better word. A lot of my patients will say like they don't like accept because it makes it feel like, oh, I'm going to accept my core fears, that like I have to accept them as true. But instead, it's just that we allow space for them and we don't try to get rid of them, but we also don't try to solve them. We just let them be there, let them come and go, right? And let them be a thought. And so that's really the concept of ERP, right? I have an intrusive thought, like, okay, there it is. I'm going to choose to not do anything about it and move on. Not, oh, I have a thought, I can't think about it. Let me think about something else. And then it keeps popping up, but also not, let me make sure that's not true and engage in rituals where I'm going to get more and more stuck, right? So I think it's really, really important. And I think that you definitely want to, acceptance is a huge piece of ERP treatment. Next question is, what if this isn't OCD? It's a terrifying thought because I feel like staying uncertain about this could be ignoring a true problem, like I'm digging the wrong direction out of a dark tunnel. Any tips? This is a great question. We get this all the time where, so many people, your OCD then latches on to whether it's OCD, right? We've seen this, we've lived it, we've all been there, right, in different ways. It's really important to acknowledge, like, you're working with an OCD clinician. Now, some of us with OCD do also have comorbid conditions, right? Like maybe you do have PTSD and maybe this is more trauma and PTSD that needs to be addressed differently than OCD, or maybe this is eating disorder and OCD. We want to make sure we do know for ourselves, hey, what is our OCD? And the reason that's important is because every disorder has evidence-based interventions. And so we do want to make sure for OCD treatment, we're doing ERP, which is the most evidence-based intervention, but maybe for something like PTSD, you're doing a trauma-based intervention, which is cognitive processing therapy, prolonged exposure, or EMDR, which are the most evidence-based interventions. And so, anywho, if you know it's OCD, again, we need to lean into and accept, or I don't like using the word accept, so I kind of want to get rid of that, allow space for the thought about what if it isn't, but choose to not solve that. And what will happen is when we quit engaging, you guys, so we quit choosing to solve our OCD questions, we get more clarity and the question gets solved on its own. I want you to think about that, right? That like when we let it go, it actually resolves and solves itself. But the more we try to solve it, the more stuck we become in the process. Next question. Sorry, I'm putting these in so we can talk about them all. So a second. Next question. My husband has OCD and is retiring very soon. We've checked with our financial advisor and we're in a good place financially. His OCD is refusing to let him accept that. He's going round and round in his mind of how we're not going to survive. This is such a question that hits home because you guys, my husband's an engineer and I feel like we're doing financial spreadsheets, or he is once a week, and I'm trying to explain to him that like every time you do this spreadsheet, you're engaging in a checking behavior. Right, you're just causing yourself more anxiety and more distress. And so the reality is you have to say, okay, we have hired a financial advisor to give us feedback. We're going to trust what they say and we're going to let it go. But anytime we are trying to make sure, are we sure we're financially sound? How do we know they're right? We need to think more about this, right? Any of these things, you guys, we get more stuck. And so the only way to let it go is to lean into it, right? To be able to say, like, I'm scared, but I'm going to trust him and move forward. And like, I can't get it right, but like, I'm going to allow space for the unknown and move forward and move through this so that I can feel more comfortable with it. But the more you try to know for sure, right? Y'all know that saying, OCD is all about needing to know for sure. The more we try to know for sure, the more we get stuck. Sorry, y'all. Woo, next question. When I'm using uncertainty statements, I notice that most of the time it makes me feel better. Should an uncertainty make me feel worse? Maybe I'm in the wrong state of mind. It's a great question. So actually, you guys, if you're doing ERP all the way, you actually should get freedom and it should feel pretty good. I'm going to give an example that I love about this. So sorry if y'all heard this. If you have a fear of throwing something valuable away, and we can all agree that like your exposure would be to throw something in the trash, the response prevention would be to not check the trash, right? You bag it up, you don't check it. But if you take that trash bag and you carry it to the garage and you set it in the corner of your garage, and that patient tells me, Liz, I did ERP, it's not working. I'm like, well, what do you mean? Tell me more about it. And they're like, well, I did the exposure, I threw something away, I did the response prevention, I didn't check the trash, I put it in the garage. But throughout the day, I kept thinking about it. It kept coming up. I kept being triggered. I kept thinking, well, maybe I should go check the trash. And I'm just, I can't let go of it. I'm so triggered by it that like, I think I might just end up going and checking the trash. And it just feels like it'd be easier at this point if I would have just checked the trash because of the mental capacity that it's taken on me. Is that ERP all the way, you guys? I would ask that patient, so I want you to take that trash to the curb Thursday morning when the trash man comes. And guess what happens? Those of us with OCD always say this. It was so bizarre. I took it to the curb, the trash man hauled it off, and I felt this sigh of relief. And I'm like, what? You felt relief? Like, why did you feel relief? You did a bigger exposure. You did something that was more triggering for you. Tell me about that. Well, I realized once the trash man hauled the trash off, there was nothing I could do anyway. Whether I threw something valuable away or not, it didn't really matter. I couldn't fix it. I couldn't do anything about it. And I ended up having clarity that like I knew I didn't throw something away, but also I wasn't worried about it anymore because it was irrelevant if I had. Every time you guys do ERP, you have to be taking that trash to the curb and letting the trash man haul it away. If you are leaving exposures to where they can still be undone, to where you can still go fix it or address it later if you need to, that is white knuckling. That is holding on. That is not going to get you freedom. But actually, if you take that trash can to the curb, even though that's the harder exposure, that often does give you freedom because you've leaned all the way in. And so, no, I don't always think that if you're getting freedom when you're doing it or it's making you feel better, it's not always bad. It should be a little bit harder. It should be difficult to do in the time being, but it should give you freedom. Live question from Carla at 6:43. Do you see where indecisiveness plays a part in OCD, like having trouble making life decisions overall and not just everyday tasks? This is a great question because I think that it really is, it really is hand in hand. So what I mean by that is that this sounds a little bit more like GAD, generalized anxiety disorder, where we do see with GAD that individuals overall struggle with decision making. Maybe it's ordering something off a menu, making life decisions, right? Like it just, the anxiety is there. And oftentimes individuals with OCD do have comorbid conditions, and GAD is one of the highly comorbid conditions with OCD. So that would make sense. With that being said, that's not necessarily OCD. It may be more anxiety based. It could be OCD. So again, it really depends on what is the reason for the difficulty of the life decision, right? Is it a life decision around your relationship and it's based in ROCD? Is it a decision around cooking for the day and it's based around contamination? Then those are OCD. And we need OCD decisions. We need to address them as OCD. OCD triggers, sorry. If it's more about just like, I don't know what college to go to, and I'm struggling to make a decision, and I'm struggling to decide on it, and I've got two good options, and I'm just really stuck in the unknown, it may be more generalized anxiety disorder. The great news is that treatment is very similar, right? The most evidence-based treatment for OCD is ERP, which is a form of cognitive behavioral therapy. For generalized anxiety disorder, we're also going to use cognitive behavioral therapy, right? We're going to use what's called CBT and really do some exposure work and other work that's very similar, but to help you learn that we don't want anxiety to be what's making the decision, right? At the core, we want to make sure you're able to make decisions, not that anxiety is playing a factor in your decision-making process, right? So that anxiety might be, I want to make sure I make the right decision. I want to make sure I make the perfect decision, right? All of these things, which is just not useful. And so the good news to think about is that CBT really, really does work for all of these disorders. There's just specific types of CBT that are more effective depending on what you're dealing with, but you want to talk to your clinician about it. William, I'm going to go back to your question. Sorry, I missed it earlier at 6:26. So explaining why an OCD fear way gives it power. I'm not totally sure what you mean. Let me just think about this for a second. So I'm thinking that, so if we don't address what the core fear is that's causing our OCD symptoms to stick, we are definitely going to continue to have the power, right? You give it power by either avoidance or compulsions, right? Ritualizing. So that's how we make it grow and make it bigger, give it more power. But we aren't going to strip the power from it until we lean into and address our core fears as well. I love you guys. I love all these comments and questions. So I am going to do one more question and then we will wrap up for the day. So if y'all have any more questions to ask, please go ahead and put them in the chat now. This is a question that gets a lot of traction, so we are going to go here. Why is it so hard to find a therapist who offers ERP? So, y'all get my soapbox. Welcome. This is 6:52 with Liz M. There are for the most part, three of us in the country that do, a handful of us for sure only, that do full residential OCD specific treatment, meaning it's an OCD specific cohort, day, night, etc. And a handful of really intensive programs and training programs across the country that are OCD specific, led by OCD specialists that have been around for a long time and that do work that's rooted in evidence-based work. So work that's rooted in research, things that are guided by what we know works. And so unfortunately, training opportunities for OCD treatment are just not that readily accessible, right? They're a bit limited. In addition, the educational system, when you treat, so when we go to school and become clinicians and get our degrees, we learn very little about OCD. And that's actually okay because our job is to learn about everything, right? And to be able to assess for comorbid conditions and psychosis and all sorts of other things that we also can see that is an important piece of our clinical skills and abilities. However, it's also very detrimental because oftentimes people get education and they go straight into private practice or into the field and they might say they treat OCD when really they've had like 1 3-hour course or they've attended one training. And it's very different than individuals who've made a career in this field. So we've done specialty OCD work. And I can tell y'all, I live with OCD. I've done school. I learn every single day. I am a way better clinician today than I was 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And I've always been in the OCD field, right? This is all I do. It's what I love, breathe. It's my life, right? But I learn all the time and I continue to grow. And I'm one of the very few people that is so lucky to be in an environment that this is what we do, right? We treat I run one of the residential programs in the country. So we treat with the highest level of OCD severity and get to see really severe OCD, but also get to learn so much. And so I say this just because I want to say that there's so much that needs to be done around training and treatment and things to increase access to care. And as y'all know, that is one of IOCDF's biggest missions that we're working on changing and updating and doing what we can to make that better, make that more accessible, because we know that need is so great. In addition, it is so important, you guys, that we advocate for ourselves. So when someone says they treat OCD, I want you to ask where they got trained, what their background is, how they understand ERP. Ask questions like how much of your caseload has OCD? Where do you get consultation and continued training? Do they attend the IOCDF conference every year? Are they actively involved in the OCD community? Unfortunately, we have to advocate for ourselves. We almost have to interview our clinicians to make sure they're the right fit for us and that they're a good fit. So think about all of that, you guys. It's so important to advocate for yourself because it is hard. It is hard to find a really good clinician. But what I can promise you is that when you do, your life, your relationship with anxiety and OCD will be changed forever and it'll be well worth it. Yeah, Amy, doing compulsions definitely doesn't give us certainty or control. Matthew, do you know some great mindfulness techniques for an oncoming panic attack? One of my support group members sometimes struggles with this. Yeah, so we want to address panic attacks at the core, you guys, right? So we don't want to just come up with techniques for when they might come up. It's kind of like what I always talk about when I talk about rumination disruption. Rumination disruption is not a treatment method for OCD. It might be a means of like, okay, I'm going to disrupt my rumination to kind of make it through, but we need to address why you're ruminating. We need to make sure we get rid of that core fear that causes you to ruminate to begin with, so that you don't have to spend your life disrupting rumination. That sounds miserable. That, again, is white knuckling. That's not the lifestyle we're fighting for. We're fighting for freedom, not figuring out how to survive with rumination or OCD. It's the same for panic attacks. So we want to actually get rid of the fear of panic attacks, right? So panic attacks live, and they often come on around the fear of having a panic attack or the fear of something happening, whatever it might be. We need to address the core fear. And so we want to do active treatment. So some of the really great active treatments, of course, we want to clear any medical concerns first, but are what we call interoceptive exposure. So having patients spin in a chair, do things that will elicit, drink sparkling water fast, like do things that will elicit uncomfortable feelings and discomfort that often patients get before they have a panic attack. So kind of like, we want you to start to feel uncomfortable and learn to be able to ride that wave and not panic about those feelings. Instead, we want to start normalizing those feelings so that then when or if you have those feelings in the future, they don't get the best of you and turn into a panic attack because you've done exposures around them and you're no longer afraid of those feelings of discomfort or that feeling that you need to run or you have to get away or that you have to do something about it. So there's great treatment. Panic disorder is so treatable, and panic attacks are something that we can really, really help you address with effective CBT treatment. So good to see you guys. 6:57. I love being here. It's always an honor. It's always a pleasure. Of course, I know y'all missed Ethan, but I'm grateful that I could step in tonight and share some of my thoughts and insight. Tomorrow, Chris Tronson, myself, and the incredible Allegra Castens will be on. We are going to talk about uncertainty myths. We're going to talk about ERP, and we're going to talk about what you can expect when you do ERP. We're going to talk about the freedom you should want, the clarity you can gain, and I'm just so excited to be able to talk about that live together with our panelists. I will see y'all tomorrow, 12 p.m. Eastern Time, 11 Central, 9 a.m. Pacific. Don't miss it. It's going to be an incredible live stream, and as always, you can visit iocdf.org/peace of mind to learn more about our upcoming panels, upcoming live streams, all of our content, you name it. Please make sure you also submit questions, thoughts, ideas, content you want us to cover here, because we are wanting to make sure we're doing what you want, not what we think might be needed. Thank you guys. I love your comments. Great to see you guys. See you tomorrow.